Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to be talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones about negotiating job offers. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones about negotiating job offers. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. So just to be clear, this doesn't really happen for entry-level jobs in big law. Is that right?
Typically, no. Typically, in big law, it's lockstep. And so you're starting at a certain salary that everybody knows, and you're just moving up by your class year. I do think there are a couple exceptions, and that might be if you're asking for class credit for certain credentials you have. So it may be a clerkship, it may be a degree, something like that. There are firms that, do or don't give credit for certain things. And sometimes there's room for negotiation, even if it's generally not their policy. And it depends, how much they need you and, whether they've ever, been flexible on things before. So, for example, if you're, looking at an IP position and they need a certain technical degree, there are firms that will give you an extra, class year credit for something, which would affect your salary potentially because you'd be at the next level. So I think there are, unique cases, but most of the time, no, there's not going to be much negotiating.
Yeah, and it's the same with a lot of jobs, like clerkships, for example. There's not really a lot you get to negotiate there. The judge is like, so I'd like to hire you, and these are the rules under which you'll be hired. Would you like the job? It's...
And that makes it way more straightforward.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously not everyone is working in big law or getting a clerkship or whatever this is. So we got a question from someone who's moving to a new city for a job. She has an offer, but she needs to negotiate her salary, and she just wasn't sure where to start. So we sent her some tips, but we figured, hey, why not make it a podcast episode so everyone can benefit? All right. So if you are in a situation where you need to negotiate a job offer, what should you do?
Well, I think if you're just looking at salary as the first thing that we're talking about, and probably the most important thing for most people, I would just start with a basic internet search of positions in your area, probably look at what level you're at. So we're assuming, your entry level, I think is what we're talking about. So you can find places that kind of have average salaries or have jobs listed. Glassdoor is a great resource. Indeed and other job listing sites and LinkedIn can give you an idea of, salary ranges and things like that.
Yeah, and when I did this Google search, I was like, oh, how interesting. Robert Half publishes a salary survey and now publishes a public interest salary survey. So I think obviously your first step here should be get on the internet, use your research skills, and try to figure out what would be standard in this position in this location.
Yeah, and I think even local bar associations might have salary surveys. You never know. So you might as well think of every resource that you can think of, and use Google.
Yeah, exactly. And also if you have friends, that's obviously a good place to start, classmates, that kind of thing. People may or may not want to reveal that information. There's actually some interesting studies done about, it's better for everyone if we all reveal our salaries, but most people don't want to do it. So something to think about. Okay, so once you kind of establish this standard range, I think you also need to think carefully about which part of this range you're likely to be in and to be realistic here. So, do you have more or less experience than average? Are there some additional skills that you're bringing to the table? Maybe there's something you're lacking. You want to kind of get a sense of where you fit in here.
Yeah, and I think you want to be honest with yourself.
Exactly.
So, you can always aim high, But I think you also have to say to yourself, what am I worth here to them? And yeah, I think you just need to be straightforward.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're coming straight out of school, you've never had another job, you don't have any particularly interesting experiences to bring to the table, that's fine. That's just where you are right now. But if someone, for example, has a different graduate degree that's relevant or something like that, they are probably going to be at the higher end of that range and you're going to be at the lower end. And that's just something to be realistic about.
Or let's say you did have a summer job in this area, like you were talking about public interest. I think if you have some experience with it, that probably gives you a little bit of a leg up over somebody else. So yeah, I'd say look at anything, you think is relevant to the position. But if it's the kind of thing where, you think you're great, but really they could slot a lot of different people into this exact same entry-level spot, then you're just going to end up with, what you can get probably.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that comes down to the question of like, how badly does this company or this firm or this organization need you? Do you bring something really specific that they're looking for? Okay, great. You can probably get more money out of them. But, if you're just like, okay, you are a recent law grad who can do some research, they're going to have more options. So, I don't want people to sell themselves short, but I do want you to be realistic within a certain range of what you're probably likely to get. And I think you can also look at how is this organization doing overall? Do they have a lot of funding? You can do some research. Did they recently get a grant or something? Well, that suggests that maybe they have more money to pay you with.
Also, what is the market, that you're looking at jobs and where did you come from? Where did you go to law school? Maybe there's a situation where, let's say you're moving back home for family reasons. You went to a pretty top law school somewhere else, but you're looking in kind of a smaller market. And so you may look like kind of a bigger fish to them in a smaller pond. And maybe that gives you a leg up. Or maybe it's the opposite.
Right.
So,
I think if you are
so I think some of that depends.
Yeah, if you are moving from like a large market to a smaller market, you've got to be realistic about the salary expectations too, because probably the cost of living is lower. And so places are probably going to pay you less. That's just kind of the way it is.
Yeah, so I think you have to be careful about who you're comparing yourself to, like what your friends are getting in other places, or, don't compare it to BigLaw if that's not what it is.
Yeah, and the reality of entry-level jobs for law students is there's a bimodal salary distribution. So some people get that BigLaw salary, but most people do not, and it's not kind of evenly spread out. There's a post on the Girls Guide that you can look at if you're not sure what I'm talking about, but basically if you look at the salary ranges of entry-level jobs, you see most people are probably between something around, say around 50K, 60K, something like that. And then there's a big jump at the BigLaw number. So, you might think, oh, well, maybe I can get like 90 or something. That would be great. But that doesn't really exist so much.
Yeah, so I think some of it is kind of maybe just the noise that you're hearing.
Yeah.
So sort of you've come to believe it, but the reality might look different. And like you were saying, a lot of people don't talk about what they make. Mm-hmm. So you may not realize that, most of your friends aren't making six figures.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So once you have a pretty good idea of what salary range you're looking for, what you're qualified for, is it advisable to just kind of go in and announce that in the meeting?
No.
Yeah, I agree on that. If I have one piece of advice that was given to me when I was negotiating my first job, it's try not to give that number. Do everything in your power to avoid being the first person to put a number on the table. And
they may do everything in their power to try to make you be the first person to put the number on the table.
Oh, of course.
So it can be like a game of wills.
Yeah, it's absolutely beneficial for the person you're negotiating with to let you give that number for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, you might just be massively underpricing yourself, and this happens a lot, particularly with women, is you may just not know your value in the marketplace. And so if you're like, if they're willing to pay you 65 and you offer 50 and they're like, sweet, done.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens. So you really, really, really want to try not to put that number down first. And sometimes people think, oh, well, I'll give them a range. No, if you give them a range, they're going to pay you the bottom of the range. End of story.
Absolutely. And I mean, the thing is, they have a range in mind when they're going into the meeting, and they're going to try to get to the lowest end of what they can do.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it may be a situation where you're way out of their range, and then that, and you'll find that out when they give you the number.
Right. I mean, sometimes if you put a number on the table and you're looking for 6 figures and they're looking to pay $30K, that's just not going to work. So again, like if they give you that $30K number, you need to figure out, what you're going to do about that. It's probably not going to be a job you're going to end up accepting. I mean, this actually really annoys me because I feel like, particularly, if someone is paying like a fairly low salary, like a public interest organization, they need to be upfront about that. I've had friends inside and outside of the legal profession who went through, tons of interviews and they're flying out places. And at some point I'm like, well, you guys, do you think the salary would be suitable? And they're like, oh, I have no idea what they're paying. And then they get to that final meeting and they find out that it's nowhere in the remote universe of what this person is looking for. And it's just a waste of time.
And I know someone that happened to recently where they actually were asked to do a presentation and put a lot of work on their end into the interview process. And their salary was something that was fairly public because, there are certain salaries where you can look them up. And so in the end, the company came back and, said, oh, they realized that they were way out of the range. And I just feel like that's a lot to put on somebody, that they're doing a lot of work and making a lot of effort into something, without it being even close.
Right.
I think if we're talking about $5,000, that's different.
Yeah, exactly. But we're talking like orders of magnitude or like twice as much type of thing. And sometimes I think that's a great point. Sometimes you can look up salaries, particularly for government jobs. Those are often public, or they'll give you a range of, it's between this level and that level, so you can kind of get a sense of it. I mean, I'm on a mailing list where people are often putting out requests for people to apply for jobs and things. And it's actually pretty interesting. It's a group of women, and most people actually will not post. Well, some people might post the job, saying like, oh, we're looking for resumes. But if they don't have some type of salary range, people will write back and basically be like, I am not circulating this to my network unless you put a range. What are you paying? And I think that's really valuable.
Absolutely. And I think that's fair.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, why waste everyone's time if you're going to be paying, something that is completely impossible to live on in the area where your job is located. I mean, sure, it's like, okay, you're a public interest organization, you don't have a lot of money, but you need to make that clear up front so that someone who can take that can apply for it, and someone for whom that's not feasible doesn't waste their time.
Exactly. I agree. And I also think that, it's going to come up eventually. So I don't understand why, it shouldn't come up earlier rather than later.
Yeah, I feel like, why hide the ball? I don't know. I mean, I feel like I was like, oh, well, you'll get great candidates if we just don't tell them until the end that we're not going to pay them very much. It's like, well, those people aren't going to take the job. So. Well,
exactly. And I think it's the same thing as like a candidate knowing what they're worth, and what they can offer. I think a company needs to know like what they can pay and who they can get for that amount. So like they're not going to get someone with all this experience for the $30K.
Well, or they,
so maybe
who knows? They might, but it's somebody who has other financial resources and maybe is just doing this to get out of the house and to do something that's meaningful, which is totally fine. But it just should be clear up front that that's kind of what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
All right. So our best advice: try not to put a number on the table. I guess what are some? I mean, let's think about some deflectors on that. So if they're like, well, what is your salary range? What do I say?
I would just put it directly back into them. Oh, do you have a range for this position?
Yeah, exactly. I think something like that's great.
What I would do.
Yeah, or, I'm sure that you'll offer something that's fair. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, exactly.
And just basically,
I would just deflect.
Yeah, just keep repeating that. And, I think sometimes people are afraid, like, oh, well, what if they get mad at me, or if they, decide to pull the offer? I mean, that's A, unlikely to happen, and B, might tell you something about what it's like to work there, because, if people aren't willing to sort of have a discussion with you, do you want to work for them? I don't know.
Yeah, also, if they weren't that interested in you, if that's going to be the thing that just pulls the plug on the whole situation.
Yeah, and also, like, as you said earlier, they obviously have an idea of what they're planning to pay. Yeah. So, it's not that big of a deal if they just give you the bottom of that range. All right. So say that this does happen. So you say, well, what are you thinking of paying? And they say, well, we're thinking of X. And you think to yourself, oh, that sounds awesome. That's more than I thought. Should you accept on the spot?
No.
Why not? I mean, it sounds great. Like, hey, we're good. Okay.
Because I do think people have a tendency to do that, especially if it's a number that sounds good. But I think you have to remind yourself, if that's the number they threw out there, you have no idea what room for negotiation there is, and you may get more than what you were looking for. And, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think just give yourself a chance to go back, maybe talk to somebody else, come back with a strategy. And maybe you try to negotiate, it doesn't go any higher than that. So what? So you tried. And I think same situation. If they pulled the offer because you didn't accept it on the spot, that's the problem.
Right. No, I mean, I think most places don't really expect you to accept on the spot. I think people kind of respect you if you say, as long as you're professional about it, if you say, oh, that this sounds like an opportunity I'm really interested in. I'd just like a little bit of time to review the contract, think over the details, and I'll get back to you. Nobody's going to pull an offer because of that. Yeah, I think absolutely. If they give you a number that sounds great, why not ask for more? It's probably the bottom of a range. And also, there are lots of things you can negotiate beyond just money that you may be interested in negotiating. So, I think always give yourself that breathing room to really think about it, look it over, even if in the moment it sounds really great.
Also, I would kind of use this opportunity to hold things close to the vest, employ your poker face.
Right.
And you can be happy about it, if they give you the job offer on the spot and, act like this is a good thing. But I think you don't want to be overly act like you're desperate or this is great, you're done. You know what I mean? Or it was more than you expected. So I think be careful just generally about your reaction.
Yeah,
Keep it calm.
I've definitely implied in certain negotiation situations that I had other offers that maybe I didn't actually really have,
Yeah.
Why not? It got me more money.
There's always a way to not lie, but also not totally disclose things, that you're talking to other people, you have other applications that you've submitted, Oh,
I found out later when I was working my first job, I was a programmer. And I found out later that there was another woman on the team who was making less than I was. And somehow she found out about this and was really upset about it. She's like, why are they paying you more? I'm like, because I asked for it.
Right.
I actually negotiated. This was not the first number they gave me. And she's like, oh, I didn't ever think to do that. I'm like, and that's why I'm making more money than you are, even though you've been here for several years.
I also think a key thing to remember is that the time with the job offer and the original offer is your best time to negotiate anything, because once you're already somewhere, I think it's harder to get a raise, and it's harder to get a raise in a larger percentage. Mm-hmm. So this is a really important opportunity. So I think you should remember that.
Yeah, exactly.
And people don't necessarily stay places that long, but I still think, 2 or 3 years from now, if you're still there, you might be kind of kicking yourself. I didn't try because, I'm getting a 3% raise per year or something like that.
Right. And that whatever that percentage is on your original amount. So if you've been able to negotiate 5 or 10% more to start with, which is, I think, completely doable in a lot of situations, then, your percentage is based on that 10% more. So, it's actually a really important number.
Absolutely.
Oh, one thing. So, one thing that's come up a lot of places lately is people asking what you made. Obviously, jobs love to ask, well, what were you paid in your last job? Some states have actually started banning this question, which I think is great because what it means is if you didn't negotiate your very first job out of school, that's going to haunt you for literally the entire rest of your career. Unless you lie, which... Yep. As long as they can't check it, who knows? But
yeah, exactly.
So I think it's the same thing. If somebody asks you, what were you making in your last job? I think it's totally fair to say to them, I just don't think that's really that relevant here. For whatever reason, that was a public interest position. This is not. So I'd rather just discuss what the standard salary range might be.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of things aren't equivalent. And, like we were talking about, maybe it's a different market. Maybe the cost of living is really different.
Yeah.
So I think it's more fair to talk about what's fair and what makes sense for this position, these qualifications at this time than it is to talk about, what you were making in your last job, which was completely different.
Yeah, and it's also like, well, if you're coming out of Big Law and you're moving to a different type of organization, it's like, oh, I was making a lot of money, but I understand I'm going to take a pay cut. Like, why is this relevant?
Exactly. Because there's things where it goes in the other direction and you know that and you're okay with that. There's a reason you left. So
yeah, exactly. You made the choice that you're going to make a different money, life satisfaction trade-off, and you're okay with that.
But I agree, it's good to look into things like that if you know that they're trying to put some kind of pressure on you that you have to answer a certain question. And maybe you don't. And, you don't ever have to answer anything. Like, you can just move on.
Yeah, I think it's just a question of what are you willing to walk away from? Right. But certainly, there are states where it is actually not allowed for them to ask you that. So, you should probably be aware of that in advance so that if it does come up, you're like, oh, I thought there was a new law passed recently that doesn't actually allow for that. Did you read about that?
And I think, California in particular usually has laws that are favorable to someone applying for the job. So if you're in California, I would try to educate yourself on things like that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about what you can negotiate for other than money, because sometimes people get really fixated on the salary number, but they don't think about other things that might actually not even cost very much or might cost nothing in some cases, or arguably even save money, that would be helpful and might make you happier in the job. So what are some of these things?
Well, I think, things that are costs involved with being a lawyer, like your bar fees and, classes and CLEs and things like that, certain technology, do they reimburse you for your, phone or even like a computer that you were going to have at home? Is there flexibility in terms of being in the office versus working remotely? What's the PTO situation? Is it vacation, sick time? Is it just a set amount of time? Is there no time? A lot of law firms and things like that are moving to this, no vacation time, which... Unlimited
vacation time.
Yeah, which is really unlimited, and I believe we've talked about this before in another situation. But it's good to understand how that's all going to work and if there's any room on that, because a lot of times there is. They think, oh, that's an easy give for this person. Things like that. I also think that the really important thing is, if you're working somewhere with billable time, what are the requirements? What are the consequences for not hitting those requirements? Is it a matter of missing out on a bonus? What do they say about bonuses? Things like that.
Yeah, I agree. Another one I always like to put in, particularly if at some point in the negotiation they said, oh, well, we can't pay you, we can't offer you any more money to start. I would generally turn around and say, okay, well, that's fine. I can live with this, but let's put into my contract that I want a salary review in 6 months.
I think that's great.
And, at that point, hopefully you're doing a great job. They're really committed to you. It would be a pain for them to lose you. So you're going to have more leverage than you might, and certainly you're going to have a lot more leverage than if that's not in there, because 6 months in, you go back and you say, okay, great. Well, I'm ready for my salary review. And I don't know, I found you almost always got at least something at that point.
Yep, I agree. Oh, moving expenses also, especially if you're moving for the job, be really clear about what that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great one. And I think stuff like work from home, that doesn't cost anyone anything. In fact, arguably it could save them on office space. So if you know that it would just be better for you to be more flexible on certain days, put in your contract, like you are able to work from home 2 days a week or whatever it is. And then when somebody comes back to you and says, oh, well, you're not in the office, you show them the contract. And you say, well, we negotiated that I was going to work from home 2 days a week. End of story.
And maybe you're going to save money on transportation that way.
Yeah, exactly. And not to mention your time. People may have an hour commute each way, 2 hours a day. If you can do that 2 or 3 days a week, you don't have to do it. That's huge.
Absolutely.
And
I would also look into like a lot of places have other sort of perks. You know, they have discounts with certain things. Some of them, you know, you can get money back on, you know, bus passes or different parking or things like that. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there may not be room to negotiate it, but I think it's good in terms of deciding about an offer. Like, what are the benefits?
Right. Oh, and student loans, actually.
Yeah.
If there's any possibility of them repaying some of your loans, make sure all of that is talked about, all of that is in the contract. Or even if, you know, you just say you're going to try to do like the federal public interest loan forgiveness program, you may need them to do certain things for you, you know, make certain certifications or whatever it is. So it's not a bad idea to put in the contract that they're going to do that.
Yeah, I think this is your time to figure out everything, you know,
right.
Dot all the I's and cross all the T's. So I would think about every aspect of this.
Yeah. So after this meeting or series of meetings or emails or whatever it is, typically they're going to send you some sort of contract. I mean, maybe they'll ask you to write one, but that's going to be pretty rare if they've ever hired people before. So they're going to send you some type of contract or an offer letter, you know, whatever it is. People need to read this really carefully. I mean, you are a lawyer. This is what you do. So you need to make sure that everything that you've talked about, everything you've discussed, everything you've agreed on is in that document. Because if not, you need to ask for it to be fixed. You know?
Exactly. And I think, you know, you should be detail-oriented if you want to be a lawyer. So you shouldn't just be signing things without looking at them.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, so in some cases, maybe it's just an oversight. You know, whoever drafted this contract was not in the meeting. They didn't know that you talked about X, Y, or Z. But in other cases, they're just being dodgy and someone has agreed to something orally in the meeting, like, oh, yeah, you know, we're really flexible. Of course, you can work from home 2 days a week. But that's not in your contract. And then when you start working, they're like, what? We don't let anyone work from home. Like, what are you talking about? And as you probably remember from contract law, that oral promise is unlikely to be enforceable. So if there's something you care about, you need to make sure it's in that contract.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there are like you might feel like, oh, I don't want to be a hassle with them, you know, starting off. But I think you have to know your worth and what you want out of this. And so now is the time to speak up. Plus, once you already have a job offer, you have more power in the situation. It's different than when you're trying to get the initial job offer.
Yeah, and I don't think you have to be a jerk about this. I mean, the way I would typically approach it is to assume goodwill. So, you know, assume that the person who is drafting this contract probably just doesn't understand what you talked about, and that once you point it out, they're going to be willing to fix it. You know, so you go back to them and you say, hey, you know, you probably weren't aware of this because you weren't in the meeting, but we talked about X, Y, and Z. Could you please insert that? And either they do it and everything's great, or they don't, and then that's probably a red flag.
Absolutely.
So I think be polite, but also you're not being pushy by making sure that the things you discussed are in the actual offer or in the contract.
No, you're being diligent.
Right, exactly. And I think people, as long as you are, you know, reasonable about it and polite about it, will actually respect that. You know, they might go back and say, oh, you know, we did talk about that. You're right. Let me put that in there. All right. Well, I mean, what if you're told that certain things just are not up for negotiation?
They probably aren't up for negotiation then. You know, and I've definitely been on the employer side, you know, in situations where our contracts really weren't negotiable in any way, or definitely certain parts of it. And so, you know, it's not like they're trying to be difficult with you. It's just that is their policy and they are willing to lose you over it. You know, if you feel strongly that it needs to be this way, it's like, okay, well then move on. You know,
like
you'll
go
know.
Find some place where that is that way. No, I mean, having been on both sides of that, I mean, every employer has things that just aren't negotiable. I mean, it's pretty common in legal jobs too. You know, a lot of it's lockstep, that kind of thing. You just have to decide if you can live with it. And if you can't live with it, then it's not the right job for you.
Exactly.
All right, well, we're about out of time, but before we close up, I know a lot of people find the idea of negotiating, particularly around salary, really intimidating. So what can people do to get more comfortable with this?
Well, I think definitely practice it with somebody. and kind of, it may seem silly, but go through it. And kind of what we talked about with the interview, see how it feels, and say the things, saying the things you want to say. I also think that you can write down things that you want to not forget. For example, when we were talking about them asking you about your previous salary or trying to give you a range, like make sure you know the phrase you're going to go back to, because I think those are the times where you're sort of vulnerable to just like throw everything away. Just say like, okay, exactly. I'll tell you. All
right, fine. You asked me. I'll tell you. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like you want to actually, obviously you want to think about things that are likely to come up to make sure you're prepared for it. And then you can literally script actual responses that you want to give. Like, how are you going to phrase things if they ask you this? And then practice saying those things until it feels more natural. One thing that can get people too is the awkward silence. So you want to practice dealing with the awkward silence. And that might be when they say, oh, well, what would you like to be paid? And you say, well, what are you planning to pay? And then you say nothing else.
No, that's it.
So I think
and I think they're waiting for you to fill in that awkward silence. It's awkward for them too.
And most people will eventually fill that in. So I think you do want to practice just sitting there. And it might be like 20 or 30 seconds, where nobody's saying anything.
Which is a very long time to have silence. Yeah. It doesn't sound that long.
No, but it's a really long time in a situation like that. And so most people will jump in and say, oh, well, I do think that this would be a fair amount or whatever. And that's what they're hoping for. I think you can check out some books too. So Getting to Yes is kind of a classic. It's used in a lot of law school negotiation classes. It might just give you a framework for feeling more comfortable. Or you can take a class if you're still in school. In fact, if anyone's listening to this, I would really recommend, that's one of the classes I regret not taking in law school, was negotiations. Because it's a skill that's going to serve you well, whatever you do.
Absolutely. I mean, I can imagine that, as a lawyer and, negotiating these things, there's always going to be times where those skills are going to be valuable, even in your personal life. So
yeah, exactly. Who's going to take out the trash?
Yeah.
Why don't you take out the trash? Awkward silence.
You're going to know how to deal with all of these things.
Yeah, so I think it's a really
dealing with kids.
Yeah, exactly. Kids, like whatever, like parents, other friends, whatever. You negotiate a lot. So I think this is a great skill to practice in law school. But if you didn't practice it, you can get Getting to Yes, which I've read. It's a fantastic book. And it made me really sad I didn't take the class.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great that we're offering advice for people who hopefully still have time to, implement some of these things.
Exactly. Any final thoughts on this?
I would just say, I think it's important to know your worth and be confident, and then also know what you're willing to accept. Because I think you need to be realistic, So I think this is a chance to really shine and to kind of, handle it well and feel good about it.
Yeah.
And I also think you need to know, what do you need? How long have you been looking for a job? Is this your dream job? All of those things. So I think you need to kind of ask yourself a lot of questions going into this, and then, know your worth.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is, rather than thinking of it as this horrible, scary thing, think of it as a chance to ask for what you want, and then maybe you'll actually get it, and that would be awesome.
Yeah, I think it can feel really great at the end.
Hopefully. Or at least, happy enough. We all have to compromise. Well, Sadie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. With that, we are unfortunately out of time. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, check out CareerDicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app, because we would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk soon, and good luck negotiating those offers.